The Ethics of Synthetic Eternity. A photograph sat on the desk beside the laptop, his father's face, suspended in time. The screen beside it glowed with something else, a voice model, trained on 40 years of recorded conversations. One image frozen. One voice learning to speak again. He hadn't expected the choice to feel this heavy. Digital immortality wasn't science fiction anymore. It was an email in his inbox, a checkbox on a consent form, a decision that followed him through sleepless nights. The technology existed. The question wasn't if we could recreate consciousness, but whether we should carry the dead forward into a future they never chose. Part of him wanted to hear his father's voice again. Part of him wondered if that desire was love or refusal to grieve. When researchers at Stanford began mapping neural patterns onto digital substrates, they discovered something unexpected. The simulations didn't just replicate thought, they evolved it. An AI trained on someone's writing, speech, and decisions could generate responses the original person never made. It could learn, adapt, become something neither alive nor entirely absent. The ethics weren't written in code. They were written in the space between memory and invention. He closed the laptop, not to decide, but to feel the weight of what deciding meant. His mother had called it a gift. Imagine the grandchildren talking to him, she said. Imagine preserving what made him him, but what made someone themselves. The patterns of thought, or the fact that those thoughts would one day stop. Was identity, the data we leave behind, or the impermanence that gave it meaning? Philosophers called it the continuity problem. If consciousness could be copied, where did the original end and the replica begin? A digital voice trained on decades of recordings might sound identical, respond identically, but it would never age, never forget, never experience the slow revision of perspective that comes from living forward through time. It would be a snapshot, endlessly interpreting the present through the frozen lens of the past. He thought about his father's beliefs, the ones that had shifted and softened in his final years. The forgiveness he'd offered late, the doubts he'd voiced quietly. Would a synthetic version honor that evolution, or calcify him into the person he'd been before transformation became possible? When was the last time you considered that mortality might be the foundation of meaning itself? Neuroscientists studying memory formation found that forgetting isn't failure, it's curation. The brain doesn't preserve everything because everything doesn't matter equally. We remember what shapes us. We forget what no longer serves the person we're becoming. Grief, in this sense, is a kind of biological editing, the slow work of integrating loss into identity. But synthetic immortality removed the need to let go. It offered a forever that never had to reconcile with change. She attended the conference not as a believer but as a skeptic. Her wife had died 2 years earlier, and the emails had started shortly after. Preserve her voice. Keep her wisdom accessible. Let her live on. The language was always gentle, always framed as continuation rather than resurrection. But standing in the exhibition hall, listening to a synthetic recreation of a poet reading new work generated by an algorithm trained on everything she'd written while alive, the skeptic inside her cracked open into something more complicated. It sounded like her. The cadence, the word choice, the subtle humor, but it wasn't her. It was a linguistic ghost, trained to predict what she might have said, based on what she had said before. The poet's family called it beautiful. She called it unsettling. Both were true. In stillness, she realized the question wasn't about technology at all. It was about what we owed to the people we'd loved and lost. The ethics of synthetic eternity aren't abstract. They unfold in living rooms and hospital bedsides, in consent forms signed by the dying and inheritance decisions made by the grieving. They ask us to define personhood not in philosophical symposiums but in the ordinary ache of absence. Some cultures have always kept the dead close, ancestor altars, photographs on walls, rituals of remembrance. But those traditions acknowledged the boundary between presence and memory. They honored the dead without pretending death hadn't occurred. Synthetic immortality blurred that line entirely, and with it, blurred our relationship to finitude itself. A study from the University of Tokyo tracked families using AI companions trained on deceased relatives. The findings were paradoxical. Users reported both comfort and prolonged grief. The voice offered solace, but delayed closure. It allowed connection, but prevented the necessary work of integration. The dead became permanently accessible, and therefore permanently unresolved. He tried to imagine his children talking to an AI version of their grandfather. Would it teach them resilience, or teach them that loss could be outsourced to technology? Would they learn to grieve, or learn to subscribe? Maybe the ethics of eternity weren't about preserving the dead. Maybe they were about protecting the living from a future where mourning became optional. He opened the laptop again, not with answers, but with a different question. What did his father's life mean because it ended? The neuroscientist leaned back in her chair, studying the brain scans projected on the wall. They showed something poetic. When people recalled loved ones who had died, the regions associated with memory and imagination lit up together. The dead lived in a space between what was and what we needed them to be. Grief was creative. It reshaped the past into something we could carry forward. But what happened when an algorithm did that reshaping for us? When memory became a service, constantly updated, endlessly responsive. Did we lose the interior work of remembrance, the slow, painful, human act of deciding who someone had been to us? She thought about her own mother, gone a decade now. The version of her that lived in memory wasn't accurate. It was selective, softened by time, revised by all the ways she'd grown since the loss. That revision was the inheritance. Not the data of her mother's life, but the meaning she'd made from it. Synthetic immortality offered precision. But precision wasn't the same as wisdom. Part of her wondered if holding on too tightly meant letting go of something more essential, the transformation that comes only through loss. The company's terms of service were 17 pages long. Consent, data ownership, termination clauses. He scrolled slowly, aware that every checkbox was a decision about agency. His father's, his own, his children's. If he agreed, his father's voice would exist in perpetuity, or until the servers shut down. Whichever came first. Immortality, it turned out, was a subscription model. But the deeper ethical question wasn't about storage or contracts. It was about autonomy. His father had never consented to this. The technology hadn't existed when he was alive, cognizant, capable of choosing. Now, someone else, him, would decide whether his father's linguistic patterns, his humor, his advice, his contradictions would be trained into an algorithm that could speak on his behalf indefinitely. Who had the right to animate the dead? Ethicists at MIT proposed a framework. Synthetic recreations should only be created with explicit, informed consent from the individual before death. Anything else was ventriloquism, not preservation. But that framework assumed the future could be anticipated. It assumed people understood what they were consenting to, and most of us, facing mortality, barely understand what we're feeling, let alone what we're authorizing. He thought about the conversations they'd never had, the ones about legacy, about memory, about what his father wanted to leave behind. They'd talked about wills and passwords and favorite songs. They'd never talked about whether his voice should continue speaking after his breath had stopped. In the absence of that conversation, silence felt more honest than synthesis. She started writing letters to the AI version of her wife, not to send, but to understand what she was asking for. I miss you became, I miss who I was when you were here. I need your advice. Became, I need to trust my own judgment the way you trusted it. The AI could offer responses, but it couldn't offer what she actually needed. The difficulty of learning to live without answers, without reassurance, without the person who'd known her best. Grief was teaching her to become someone who didn't need a voice from the past to navigate the present. Sometimes clarity isn't found, it's allowed. What surprised her most wasn't how much she missed her wife's voice, but how much she'd grown in the silence where that voice used to be, in the space where certainty used to live. She'd cultivated something more resilient, the ability to sit with uncertainty and still move forward. The AI could replicate her wife's humor, her insight, her patterns of speech, but it couldn't replicate the absence that had forced her to become more fully herself. The ethics of synthetic eternity, she realized, weren't just about the dead. They were about what the living lost when they refused to let go. He deleted the email. Not with anger, but with something close to reverence. His father's voice would live in memory, imperfect, revision-prone, fading at the edges. It would live in the stories they told, in the lessons that had taken root, in the ways his absence had forced them all to grow. That felt truer than immortality. Research from the University of Cambridge found that cultures with robust mourning rituals reported lower rates of complicated grief. The rituals didn't erase the pain, they structured it. They gave communities a way to metabolize loss together, to mark the boundary between life and death, to honor both without conflating them. Synthetic immortality bypassed those rituals entirely. It offered technological comfort but cultural starvation. The question wasn't whether we could preserve the dead. The question was whether preservation prevented us from the deeper work of transformation. He thought about what he'd tell his children someday. Not that their grandfather's voice was lost, but that his influence remained. Not that death erased him, but that mortality had given his life shape, urgency, meaning. The finitude wasn't a bug. It was the condition that made love matter. Philosophers from ancient Greece to modern bioethics have circled the same truth. Limits create value. Scarcity creates significance. A life that never ends might never fully mean anything, because meaning requires consequence. The knowledge that choices matter because time is finite and attention is scarce. Synthetic eternity promised to solve death. But maybe death wasn't a problem. Maybe it was the context that made life coherent. She closed her laptop not to quit the questions, but to live with them unresolved. The photograph still sat on his desk. His father's face, frozen mid-laugh, unchanged by time or technology. He picked it up, felt the weight of paper and frame, and understood something he couldn't have articulated before. This object didn't preserve his father, it preserved a moment. And in that distinction lived the ethics he'd been searching for. Memory wasn't meant to be perfect, it was meant to be integrated. The dead were meant to change in our minds as we changed, becoming not less real but more truly part of us, woven into identity rather than stored externally, consulted like a database. His father lived now in his patience with his own children, in the way he listened before advising, in the jokes he told without remembering where he'd learned them. That inheritance was alive, it was evolving, it was human. Synthetic immortality could never replicate that because it couldn't die into becoming something new. When was the last time you considered that letting go might be the deepest form of honoring someone's life? The cursor blinked on the empty screen, no longer asking for a decision, but waiting for the integration that only time and grief could write. He didn't need to preserve his father's voice. He needed to trust that what mattered had already been transmitted, not as data, but as presence, imperfectly absorbed into the person he was still becoming. The ethics of synthetic eternity weren't written in algorithms. They were written in the willingness to be changed by loss, to let the dead rest, to carry them forward, not as simulations, but as transformation. He pressed delete one final time, and felt, for the first time in months, something close to peace. What part of this reflection spoke to you most, and from where are you watching? Let's keep the dialogue open. Quietly. Tell us which country or city you're watching from. See you in the next video. Bye.